Well, Mary, let's just go ahead and get started. And everyone, thanks for coming here today. We are going to go through briefly here some of the updates in the document, many of which are in the appendix to these slides, which you should get here in the chat box here soon. And then we'll send out an email with the document once my computer decides to cooperate. So today, what we're going to do is, hopefully you can see my screen. Let me know if you can't. But we do have our regular key objectives for these meetings, which is to share updates on federal funding. And I'm going to let Mary take the first few slides here, and then I'm going to get into our capacity.
All right. So let me see, because I'm not seeing your screen. So wait a minute, let me just get this. There it is. Yeah, I got it. Yes. So essentially, what we've been doing each time is trying to build on the work before, do updates on federal funding, working on the development of some tools, and kind of trying to build guidance on the planning for the operation and maintenance of school facilities in particular, but in obviously support of the school program. On the federal side, there's little to report at this point. There is real concern about what's happening in the states. Mike Rowland just talked about a $1 billion shortfall in the state budget in Georgia. And there's real concern about that, but there's not consensus on that. They're expecting something's going to come out on Monday. And in fact, the work that we're going to be doing looking at these budget items is something that we're going to provide to folks because they need a little bit better understanding of what actually the costs associated with operating and managing schools will be for the 2021 school year on the Hill. So that will be helpful. Let's go to the next one, David. And I think we're assuming everybody knows it, but of course this is David Sturtz from Cooperative Strategies. A national planning and educational school district support firm. I don't know if I said that exactly right, David. You can correct me. And does that work?
That works.
And and Mary Filardo from the 21st Century School Fund and the National Council on School Facilities. And the National Council in particular is a nonprofit that works to support the state facilities officials on, ensuring that they're able to employ, good practice in policy and practice around school facilities. So on today's agenda, we're going to talk about what our deliverables are as we're working through this weekly process. David's got some really interesting stuff on corona capacities. And then I've been working on the budget document and really would love to get some input on some of the budget assumptions and any costs that folks are coming across in their work. And we're going to break into discussion on that one, and then we'll report back and we can talk about the next steps. The specific deliverables we're looking at is the planning template. We've been updating. You'll see we got some comments back, which were helpful, and even just today have gotten some more input that we'll be sure to put into that reopening planning template. And then I worked on the budget tool. This is essentially the second draft. The first one was very rough, so this is the second draft. But hopefully we can make some progress with it today. And then we're working to actually take the work that's being done on capacity planning and guidance and get a draft report out to folks for May 13th, and then also have a draft on cleaning protocols, really cleaning another facility like air quality protocols by May 20th. And then the last one on the hygiene and sort of the personal, whether it's, temperature taking or masks or other kinds of personal hygiene and health protocols by June. We think we have the most time with that. In some ways, that's going to be the most wiggly. Thanks, David. Why don't you go ahead and well, I'll close out with this. These are, you know, they pretty much have stood as our working assumptions around public health and public education and the economy. So, you know, if you have comments on it, please do provide it to us, because otherwise this is what's going to be in the report. Go ahead, David.
Sure. So again, apologize to those where the link isn't working there on this document. Had a last minute technical snafu, and we'll work around it today. We'll be fine, and we'll send it to you shortly after this meeting. Okay, so want to go through a sample COVID capacity exercise. We talked last week about taking a first cut at capacity by considering it 60%. But we wanted to clarify something. There's a slight word change in this quick math slide from last week, but it's important. Last week, we, I think, incorrectly said plan on a maximum school capacity of around 60%, but that's actually not true. It's a maximum classroom capacity. And that nuance is different because there are many rooms, of course, that we don't give capacity because they're not assigned spaces. And so you start with those rooms that typically do get capacity, and we consider that you have about 60% of that. Then you look at, you know, optimizing as much space as you can by decluttering, working to identify all of those spaces that could potentially get capacity that currently don't, modeling at least 44 square foot per, and then look to build back up your capacity. And if any of these formattings went a little bit wonky here, I last minute had to put it into Keynote, so it may have shifted a bit. We'll send you a clean copy with the email here to follow. Okay,
David,
so
do you want to share? Do you want me to share my screen and I can do the?
I think the next one should be fine. I just see the text was a little bit overlaid on me, but we'll get you a copy here. Okay, so here is an elementary school. This is for a district in Texas that we digitized their floor plans and did a period by period capacity analysis. So this is one of those floor plans. And this, all the green shaded spaces are traditional classrooms. And then the other spaces that are white in the center are spaces that are pop in, pop out spaces or don't get capacity, like an office, a library, cafe, stage, kitchen, gym, so on and so forth at an elementary school. And this particular school had some dedicated STEM labs for students to pop in and out of, some response to intervention RTI, so it's a tutoring room, dyslexia rooms, and gifted and talented, and ISS, and a handful of others. The yellow shaded ones are special education. So these are all rooms that students use, but they breathe in and out of. This current enrollment of this school at the time was 480. The capacity is 570. However, so we take the first pass and say, well, 60% of 570 is 342. So based on the current utilization, the current capacity, they're 84% utilized. Based on the COVID capacity, they're 140% utilized. So not going to fly. So then the next step is looking at all of these spaces that students use that could get capacity if you absolutely had to. So you could gobble up the STEM labs, you could gobble up the tutoring, gifted, RTI, dyslexia, you know, PLC room, potentially the computer lab. If you really had to, you could take half the stage and half a caf, half a gym. This is sort of, you know, all in what you could possibly do. And when we do that, modeling 44 square feet per student as our baseline minimum, the capacity actually gets up, the physical capacity gets up to 812. So way more than we need. Of course, this is not an operational, we'll talk about, you know, human resources next, but this is just physical resources. We could recapture a lot of these spaces for capacity. So because we actually have more than we need when we take this, identify all the potential spaces, then we could go back and say, well, that would be the extreme circumstance, but we know, as Guy mentioned in the chat, we have some mandated services that we have to deliver. We have, you know, some things that are just part of our curriculum we have to do. So we could back out those suboptimal spaces to get back closer to the capacity that we need. And so this is when we just took it and said, all right, well, we're not going to teach in the cafeteria. We're not going to teach on the stage. We're not going to teach in the STEM labs. We're not going to teach in, some of the support spaces. And we're back to a capacity that fits this building. This is at 44 square feet per student in the spaces that aren't currently used as classrooms, but could be. So that's just an exercise that, we're going through and we're laying out the steps here of starting with that 60% of your classroom capacity, then identify all the potentially reclaimable space. And then from that, then going back and paring it down to getting rid of those spaces that you could teach in, you had to, if you could teach in if you had to, but you'd rather not. Comments, questions on that basic flow to determine a COVID capacity, because we think that's pretty much the logic, but want to know if there's something missing or thoughts on that you might have.
And really it's not only the logic, but it's actually the due diligence that every school is going to have to do when looking at social distancing at the standards that the health folks are giving us.
David, this is Michael
All right.
Elliott from Oregon. Again, really like this, but yeah, I think it's good that you did the third step where there is a lot of SPED that's mandated. There's a lot of pullouts. There's other areas. And so it shows that even schools that possibly have capacity may not have capacity. And it requires a lot of creative thinking, I think, on the part of schools to make a school function. And it sounds like what your hope is this is just an example that school districts would then take and say, okay, assuming 60%, assuming 44 feet, what do my schools like in terms of capacity, and how can I maximize, how can I make sure this happens?
Exactly. So, if the option or mandate comes down, open for all students, right? Well, if you just took the 60% of classroom capacity, it'd be like, well, gosh, we can only open 1 or 2 days a week. If we can recapture some of this capacity, maybe we can open 4 days a week, maybe 5 potentially. And yes, taking into consider those local considerations of what's mandated and what you need to offer there, that, really can't be done as a blunt instrument for every district, but hopefully we just lay out some guidance here that can be followed. Yeah. Nathan asked the question, what is the capacity to focus on in this third back out slide? The capacity to focus on is at 83%, Nathan. So you see the current, capacity, how the building is currently used is 570, 84% utilized. Once we backed out 60% of the classroom capacity and then captured some spaces, we brought the effective capacity of this building a little bit higher to 581, giving it an 83% utilization. So the point of this really one is to show that we can, in this case, I know it's not going to be possible in every school, but in this case, we were actually able to get back to effectively the same capacity as we were before.
Right, and the challenge here, and I think, David, if you go to the next slide, the challenge, of course, is going to be the staffing. So here, essentially, what David's done is really gone over what's the data and analysis that you need in order to determine a corona capacity. But that work is hardly done, because you have to really give that to the local school, the principals and the teachers and the administrators, because how you operationalize that, go ahead and go back, David, to the last one, how you operationalize it so that all of those pink classroom blocks are staffed with a teacher, because you've only got probably, I don't know, in terms of the classes, do you have 14 kids in those classes? I don't know what your classroom square footages are on most of those spaces, David.
Let's see.
Are they
Actually,
800 square foot classrooms roughly?
I have my partner on the call. Matt, what were these square footages? Do you have that open?
Give me 1 second. I think they were primarily in the 800 to 900 range. So we
So
were
how many kids were you estimating per room?
so in the current, with all of those green spaces, the regular classrooms, we were giving them 22 students per classroom. And then when we took 60% of that, that gets you down to 15 or 16. So I would guess it's right around that range for most of those standard size classrooms. And then you've maybe got a computer lab that's a little bigger, or the science lab you see over there, 221 is probably a little bigger. So maybe those are 18 or so.
Right. And on those are the
Right.
ones where we took the new spaces, like the computer lab. We took the square feet of that. We divided it by 44 to give the maximum COVID capacity for
Right.
that space. So some of your next steps, if you were in this school and had this circumstance, and you're like, wow, okay, we can make that work, and from a facility standpoint, then if you could make it work from a staffing standpoint, let's say you're able to mobilize, for example, substitute teachers as basically staff augmentation here, to be able to operate in this manner, then you could also look at increasing that 44 number to a little bit higher, because that's really what we think is a good minimum for a square foot per student. And the maximum, I've seen, we calculated numbers 3 times that for sort of what would be a maximum, we call it the fat and happy capacity. And so you could look to even give a little more space if you're able to make it work. And those are some of the knobs that you can turn once you get to this point.
So
Right, go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
David, where does the 44 comes? It's the minimum, but I think for some states, that's like the recommended requirement for kindergartners in normal settings. So is there any adjustment for, like, again, kindergartners needing a more minimum, or is that something, again, a state by state or district by district would have to figure out?
Fantastic point, Michael. And that's something that we can look to amend this for the next go around, because this did not consider that variation, but could. And what it assumes, frankly and unfortunately, is that there's fairly little movement in the classroom, which is not how a lot of folks want to teach and not how a lot of kids want to learn. That's something we've mentioned a few times in these webinars is, it kind of pains us to make those recommendations, but at the same time, we know that we've got a bigger picture here to deal with. So, we could look at, what would that be if it starts at 44 for a kindergartner? We could provide that calculation here pretty quickly. So I'll add that to the mix, so we can adjust.
I think that's right. And the other thing, I don't know if Sharon Danks is on the call, but I know that she has sent in and will make it available to everyone, kind of outdoor, use of space. And certainly more of the kindergarten and early childhood is accessible to an outdoor area. And it could be that some minor modifications to that could give you the opportunity to have kids, inside and outside, and spread them out in that way, and make it a whole lot more interesting for the kids as well.
Yeah. Did you want me to add to that?
Yeah. Go ahead, Sharon.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I work with an organization called Green Schoolyards America, and we work in general with looking at how schools can use their outdoor space for teaching and learning and play. And so in this particular moment, we're collaborating with some local partners here in the San Francisco Bay Area to think about how school grounds can be assets to increasing capacity. So if you're at the 60%, how do you bridge that gap to get closer to 100? And we think that the school grounds and local parks within walking distance could be potentially put into play in some places, particularly with milder climates, for taking, say, 10 to 50% of the population. And the staffing issue is also a key one there. So we are thinking about exploring issues of how you might activate the non-formal education sector, people who work in teaching field trip classes at museums and nature centers and other places who already have teaching experience and expertise in being outside with classes, to absorb somehow some of that capacity, the details of which we haven't yet worked out, but that's the direction we're thinking.
Okay.
And this also kind of takes into play or consideration the rethinking the physical activity component, how recess and PE might be taught in a space that is shared with classrooms, and where in those situations they can no longer touch balls and shared equipment, and how before and after school programs might be affected because parents going back to work need longer care than school days. And we're also thinking through the fact that all the kids that come back will have had trauma from this time. So mental health, bringing the kids outdoors is positive for mental health restoration and stress reduction. So trying to combine those thinkings, and it's still at an early stage, but we do have a concept document and we're working on a longer one.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon.
To that end, Mary, do you want to mention briefly the National Academy of Sciences conversation, and we'll get into budgeting?
Yeah, so one of the things that I love that budgeting, that one of the things that we're concerned about as it relates to the budgeting piece, and again to what's going to be the fiscal realities in a lot of places, is that if we follow all of the guidance, kind of to the letter that we're getting from public health and others, frankly, that we need to understand the cost, and we also need to understand the cost as it relates to the value of what we're doing. And we could use guidance on the research in order to make really rational decisions about the guidance. So I'll give you one example. Taking like no touch temperatures of every kid that comes into the school. This is one of the things that's being proposed, and it's been done in many of the schools sort of at closing in South Korea, and they've done it in the SARS, during SARS. And so there was a study that was recently published looking at 500,000 children in Singapore who had their temperatures taken every day, and then they looked at sort of, what were the health benefits of that and some of the problems. And what they found is that it did very little in terms of identifying any cases of SARS. It actually ended up excluding, really out of 500,000, not a whole lot, but about 60 students who just happened to have a really high temperature but didn't have any problems, any health problems. And the researchers' conclusion was that it was important or useful from a psychological perspective that people felt safer, but that it didn't actually do much from a health perspective. Now, part of what I would say is that I don't really know whether that was a good study or not. And I would argue that we need, however, better input into which of the research studies and which of the mitigation strategies will actually bring us the best benefit. And so we reached out to the National Academies of Sciences and have asked them to look at the kinds of things that we're looking at in our planning, reopening and operating tool, and to give us good advice so that states and districts are going to be better able to evaluate, what risks and what value there is to any of these strategies. So you know, if you need masks or if you don't, if you want to be taking temperatures of every kid or not. Sort of these are things that we want to have good research on, so that we're doing the things that will make kids most safe, but also that will enable schools to really go about the business of educating kids. So anyway, so that's just something that we're working on now, and really trying to make sure that that any guidance that comes out from this process or other processes, frankly, that we're not just sort of grabbing at things because, you know, we're anxious, but that we're doing really what makes sense, you know, with the best information we have. So with that, we've got in the budget tool expenses associated with community support, with facilities operations, with off-site social distancing, which is the remote learning, and on-site social distancing, which is, you know, essentially trying to expand the space that you have available for instruction, and then budgeting with health protocols. And so, David, how will we do this if folks can't get the link?
So I'm thinking what we can do is we can just you know, we'll be a big small group and look at it kind of slide by slide and see, just crowdsource it here. What we want to do is we have some initial assumptions that Mary's going to talk about on how the math is built. And then we're going to go through these 6 different budget items with some of the expenses that we've recorded in these conversations. And a handful of them have some budgets already calculated, and many of them we're looking for your input on. So what I think we'll do is, as we go through these slides, we'll pause over each one. If you could take a look at them, and, you know, if you have experience with any of these budget items and can say, oh, you know, my unit cost for hotspots is X or what have you, feel free to toss that out. If we're also going to ask for your feedback on some of the assumptions. So as we read through some of these assumptions, budget assumptions, if you question those or have, you know, an additional consideration, please just speak up. And then we'll send the document out here following the meeting, and would very much appreciate any written feedback following.
Okay. All right. So we're going to start with so what folks should understand is that many of my budget estimates are based on national numbers. And partly I'm using those because those are the ones that roll off the top of my head, in the same way that your own state numbers might roll off your head, or your district numbers, but these are the ones that I keep in my head. So there are about 50 million public school students. There's about 100,000 K-12 public schools, about 15,000 school districts, 3.5 million classroom teachers, about 5 million of school staff. And a new little piece came out, which I found was kind of interesting, is 82% of the public schools have a full or part-time nurse. I think they're about, and this one I'm really, because these were mostly, I know this one I think is about right, which is 15 million students in public school aftercare. Sharon, you might have a better number for that, but I think it's something like that. And there's about 7.5 billion gross square feet of public school space. So when you see the multipliers and the estimates, when I'm saying, oh, there's a student multiplier, this is what I'm working from. If there's a school multiplier, it's for the nation. And what we hope to be able to do is create the multipliers so that we can do them by state, and you could come up with state level estimates on whatever would be the appropriate assumptions for your states, and it could be done at the district level as well. So go ahead to the next slide, David. Okay, so what we've done is we've said, okay, there's a community support element of responsibility associated with, operating schools in general, but what we're looking at is the marginal difference, right, that this public health environment kind of puts us in. So we're saying that it is likely that through the 20 and 21 school year, that families, given the incredible levels of unemployment, that families may well need extra food, so that the feeding programs may have to continue to support, not just the students, but the student's family. So that's an assumption. Now, probably what I would do is, and some of you folks will know it because you're in charge of food service programs, is, what is a meal for a student? How many students do you typically do in your program? And what might be, it might be, you would assume a 10% increase or a 20% increase. And then that would be the unit, and that would generate sort of an increased food service cost associated with extending feeding programs to families. So I don't want to work through that one right now, but let me take a moment and see, does that make sense as kind of an approach, or do I need to kind of walk through that again? And let's see, I should be looking probably at the chat.
I'm managing the chat. You can manage that.
So Mary, this is
Wait,
Debbie
yeah.
from Virginia. So
Yeah, hey.
if we're in regular school, then we are feeding our students. So this need for food service is if the schools continue to be shut down. So we'll have a school feeding program over the summer. That's usually something that we offer anyway. And normally during the school year, those kids that need it have a brown bag program funded by churches in the community. They send us the food and we brown bag it for the kids to take home for the weekend. So this food service cost is really if the schools are closed, remain closed, I think.
Right, although, yes, and that may make sense, that there would not be in your community, that you would not anticipate an added cost on that, and then that would be one that you would not include. I am in part referencing,
perhaps.
right, this is why these assumptions are important sort of by district. I think last week, and I think Lynette, I'm trying to remember now, I don't know if she's here, from Baltimore City, but was talking about they were essentially providing food to anyone who was coming to the feeding sites, and that work may actually need to continue with food distribution. So that would be particular to a different community. So that would be something that might be zero cost in your community, and it might be include a cost in another community. Let's go to the next one, maybe just for a second. And so one of the things that it may be, no, go back to the community one. I'm sorry, David, just to give another example. So there are a number of, I'm sure in many districts, there can be, in some of the big urban districts, there could be hundreds of non-school users of the facilities. Now, I don't know that there's a cost to this, but there certainly is a time element to this, of communicating with your community users, people that use it. I mean, I'm in the District of Columbia. They would use them for church services, certainly use it for sports teams, using it for after-school programs that are not school connected, but that are privately provided in the schools. So this is something, again, it may not have a cost, but it might have a cost as you're developing guidelines and communicating this to community users. I'm gonna walk through a few of these. So nurses, and you'll see it come up in another area, but if you are still operating aftercare programs in your schools, it may be that you want to retain the nurses into your aftercare, at some overlap in your aftercare period. So these are things that you would try to quantify, but also the request to everyone is, what are some of the other things that you might see? So for example, in this one, I took a shot at it. So if before and after school care is going to be provided, they also will be required to meet the social distancing and the higher levels of cleaning. I said, all right, assume that the cost then might increase by 10%. Right now, the in-school programs cost an average of $100 to $500 per month. I took the middle amount, $250 a month for in-school aftercare, said that's a $25 a month increase times 9 months. That's essentially the cost just went up $225. If you multiply it times the 15 million kids, that's $3.3 billion, almost $3.4 billion of added cost to after-school programs. So again, when you're doing the nation, it's a really big number, but even in the within one school, that number may be significant. And you're talking about families that may be out of work, looking for work. This is a really, it's going to be a really big deal if the requirements on the aftercare programs increase. So that gives you an idea sort of my processes as I did this. Folks should add elements to this and change their assumptions. If in your community your childcare is free, it's going to be a cost to somebody, but maybe it's only a 10% increase on 100. Maybe it's a 5% increase. This is where I think these assumptions will change. But go ahead, David. On the operations side, there's a whole fair number of things that are being recommended to look at, whether it's the filtering in your HVAC systems, bipolar ionization. Again, these are the things for your mechanical engineers to be looking at. I don't know what the unit costs are of using HEPA filters and evaluating whether or not your fan system is going to be strong enough to get air through a really dense filter. Lots of schools aren't even going to have central, HVAC systems, but this is something that we want to quantify. We want to try to understand. So we're going to be working on that, working with other partners to get information on that. So that's a really critical piece on the air quality. Some of the other added things with water sitting for, in our systems, because if they haven't been used in the drinking fountains and the sinks, et cetera, flushing it and maybe even testing the water before it's turned on is maybe a one-time thing, but it might be considerable. But again, maybe it's 1,000 a site or 500 a site, and will be a different number. You can see there's a $7 billion for custodians. If schools are going to have to be cleaned to a huge, basically almost to a hospital standard in terms of disinfecting, wiping down surfaces, maintaining a much higher level of clean, this is going to be a big cost. And so you can see I made a set of assumptions that even if we staff at 20,000 a gross square foot, we think that on average, we're probably only staffing at about 35,000 when we look nationally. And so we would need to increase custodians by about 1.25 custodians per school. Obviously, high schools, it would be more. Elementary schools, you know, it might be half a custodian in order to meet a 20,000 square feet per custodian. So why don't we take a minute and talk about that, because that's $7 billion. That's a big cost. So I'd love to hear some folks respond on what they feel like their capacity will be to clean and disinfect schools operating in the fall.
Mary, this is Guy. A little bit of it is going to depend on what the requirements we get from CDC, what we get from our local public health, and quite frankly, that's been a moving target. And I think it's probably going to be subject to some political pressures. But from my former district, it would be something on the order of 35 to 40% increase in custodial costs.
Mm-hmm. Right, to meet, and again, that's why, you know, part of what we're looking for with our research partners is, you know, what are the protocols, what are the procedures, what's really involved in this in order to make sure that we're making a recommendation. But right now, I mean, even it's 10,000 square feet per custodian, which is sort of a hospital level clean. We're just saying a really high standard of school clean, which is 20,000 square feet per custodian. Now that's with them cleaning it. You know, as we all know, custodians, they end up, you know, setting up the science fair and moving the furniture around and doing all kinds of things that are, you know, for assemblies and other kinds of things. They are asked to do a lot that isn't cleaning. We're talking about, you know, 1 8-hour shift of 20,000 square feet of actual cleaning. So yeah, I mean, that's going to be a big number. And that's partly, again, what we want to get to folks in Congress is like, okay, if this is the requirement, then we have to fund it. You can't take this, you know, the school districts that are getting, you know, going to see real challenges fiscally and then say, oh, but by the way, you've got to, you know, increase your custodians by, you know, 30 to 40%.
Alex's comment about disinfecting
yeah.
every desk, estimate 21 grand a day for one serving over 100,000 students.
Right. Yeah.
So that's,
so,
yeah,
and what
somebody mentioned earlier in here, just, it seemed natural, if I understood it right, that, you know, we crowdsource, much like we're trying to crowdsource some of the solutions here to these reopening strategies and so forth, and crowdsource the cleaning. Can you put disinfectant in kids' hands and say, clean your desk? You know, or do we have to pay for that?
Not without a real liability issue that I don't know anybody wants to tackle.
Yeah, that's why I said my earlier comment we might need some attorneys involved. Yeah.
No, I would never want students handling disinfectant. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. So you can see what we're trying to construct here, and it's obviously based on sort of what's out there in the ether as you know, recommendations on what should be done. So I had, you know, hand sanitizers with students washing 3 times per day, and my good friend Jerry from Philadelphia said, okay, it takes 2 milliliters of, you know, he sort of broke it down, And so I'm like, okay, you know, that's 3 times a day. And, you know, I forget, I think I got the math right, but it was $3 million of hand sanitizer. And then of course, part of what I was running into is I was looking for some of the pricing on some of this is on much of it, you can't get it. And this is partly why we need to get the big numbers and the composite numbers out there, because in the same way that with testing, you know, if you don't have swabs and you don't have the, you know, the medical glass, you can't do what you need to. Well, if the kids have to have hand sanitizer, we can't open the schools if you can't get hand sanitizer for 50 million kids, right? So these are other issues. So thank you, David, for moving us forward here. So one of the things that we know is being said is that the schools may have to, you know, they may be closed at various points, and that the off-site social distancing, which is really what we're doing now with the schools until they're closed for the summer, is the kids have technology, you know, kids and teachers need technology hotspots, internet service at home. There needs to be mailing materials. And certainly for returning, there's going to have to be some technology that was sent home with kids that was actually designed to be used in the schools replaced. So we are looking for, you know, help in sort of putting these numbers together to understand. And we know there are other folks definitely working on this. So we think there'll be some good information about, you know, Chromebooks and hotspots and others. But to the extent that you have other things to add to that list associated with the off-site social distancing, it would be helpful. And I'd be curious, you know, even I don't know how much was mailed and what those mailing costs were, but I'd love to get a better number on how often things were being mailed to students, and what those costs were. So that's related to the off-site social distancing. Yeah, and I see Sharon's comment that, yes, I have also heard that the sanitizer is not as good as hand washing.
Right.
But what we know is that many of our schools, you know, they just don't have very many sinks.
No.
And while I think we should be looking at outdoor sinks, especially in mild climates, many of our schools don't have nearly enough sinks for kids to be able to do the hand washing that they need to do. Then the on-site social distancing is really what David was walking us through, but there are some, you know, both minor projects as well as more major projects that would involve being able to utilize your space better. And one of the things that, you know, and disclaimer, I don't have any money from the cooperative strategies, and but I think actually that engaging architects and planners who you've been working with in your communities to walk through some of what is done would actually be very useful. And I threw a number onto it, but if 8,000 districts did it, just to give you an idea of the scale, that's $60 million that they weren't going to be spending. Mm-hmm. The outdoor structures, and this is related to the work that Sharon and her team are doing, you know, it could be minor, but even so, if you do it in 5,000 schools, you know, at 15,000, you know, a project, it could be putting some pavers out in an area so that if kids are sitting out there regularly, it doesn't turn to mud, or it could be a tent structure over top of an area. You know, it could be any number of things. And we've asked that they give us some sort of specific kinds of projects that you could do. So this is, there are going to be costs associated with this, even the landscaping to support outdoor use as part of the school day. And then, portables is obviously a really big cost, and even 200,000. I mean, certainly you can't do it in the District of Columbia for that, but there probably are places you could do it for, 150, 200,000 to get a modular. But even if only 2,000 school sites do it, it's 400 million at $200,000 a portable. So, markings outside of schools. Go ahead.
And they don't just pop up overnight.
Right, and guys comment that getting access to them is going to be a challenge, and then the time, the time that it takes to order and fabricate and install is going to be a problem.
Yeah.
On the site markings, this is something that I think actually could be sort of fun, and one could get their community and volunteers. They'd have to be very far apart, but it might be that there's very little cost to this. And if half of the schools did it though, and even with $200 worth of supplies, that's $10 million. So there's a lot of, when you think about it together, there's a lot of cost associated with this. I think that the total, go ahead to the next one. I think we did that one, did we? Oh, the public health protocols. No, not yet. But just to, you'll see it when you get the worksheet, but it's about, I think I had 16, all of this added together was about $16 billion. So, replacing some lavatory fixtures. Now, I put it in at 25,000 because what I know is that as soon as you go into an old bathroom and you try to change out some plumbing fixtures, you're going to run into problems. But if 25,000 bathrooms, and think about it, we have 100,000 schools, you've got at least 2 bathrooms in a school, and in some of them you might have 10. So again, just to get a sense of scale, if you just did 25,000 lavatories, that's $625 million. Signage and wayfinding in schools is going to be important. If you got some help and fabricated these at 2,500 a school, and every school got it, that's 250 million. One of the big ones was if just the 18,000 schools that have no nurses got a nurse at only 50,000, which seems low to me. But that's $900 million for nurse positions. Another issue that people are very concerned about is mental health professionals. Again, if just 20,000 schools got mental health professionals at only 56,000 a person, that's $1.1 billion for health professionals. So there's really, you can see that when you look at it together, you get a better sense of really the level of work and cost that school districts are being asked to assume associated with reopening and then operating schools within this environment.
Yeah.
So David,
and then
go ahead.
As we wrap up here, Mary, you're looking to get a big number. The reason we're modeling this on the total unit estimates for the country is we want to get some federal legislation, help direct some of that so that there is some federal dollars that come for this, because right now that's been overlooked, except for the emergency relief, governor's relief fund in the beginning and some FEMA, but looking to help seed some thoughts for the next legislation. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, part of it is, I think that both, we ourselves need to understand kind of how cost is going to get attached to reopening, but it's also to make sure that as the discussions around, CARES 4, I think they're calling it, is done, that the operational elements are very much a part of their considerations. Whether or not, right now there's like for the 13.5 billion, there's a lot of flexibility. So we want to make sure that governors and states understand what some of these costs are, but also what the nationally what these costs are. And yeah, I see Nathan is absolutely true that getting the teachers into in the spaces is going to be huge. And it may be that to open up the economies appropriately, that some of the part of what's going to happen is the teachers will be responsible. There might be, an aide, a minimum wage person who is hired, out of the unemployed to just be the monitor in a classroom, and the teacher's students might be in two classrooms, and they might be working on some of the remote tools in terms of online learning, even as the teacher is basically in one classroom or another. So this is partly where I think getting some of the space plans out to the educators in the schools, they will be creative, but they're going to need time to do that in order to deploy themselves appropriately to deliver instruction to all of the kids that are in their building.
Can you simulcast, if you're splitting a classroom up in essentially half, could you simulcast instruction, in two spaces? Could potentially happen, and kind of flip-flop where you're physically present as long as you had another adult in the room. And keeping in mind that the numbers that we're using there, that 44 square feet, that's a minimum. If you can do more than that, do it. That is squeezed in 3-foot radius around everybody with a couple feet on top of that for a teacher to walk around in the front. That's it.
Right.
So if you can do more, for sure.
So just to comment on Rob's, I think that's a really good suggestion. Sort of what's a one-time versus an ongoing expense, and to sort of create a categories. And I think what we may do in part, like pull out the capital and the operating in that way, but there are also some essentially operating expenses that might be one time. So that's a really good suggestion.
Mm-hmm. And then lastly here, as we run out of time, I just wanted to go through briefly some of the appendix slides here. Jeff Vincent forwarded some initial scenario thinking that we're already kind of down this road, but I wanted to bring it to your attention. You can see, generally speaking, the different scenarios that are being envisioned for reopening, from full remote to largely normal and something in between. And of course, that's what we're working on. One of the chat conversations here was about social distancing and isolation, and one of the goals here is, and we look at these these social distancing, is to, insofar as you can, keep students in small enough units so that when a student or staff member is exposed, the fewest number of staff and student possible have to self-isolate, and the rest can continue on in the building as normal. So it takes the level of operational planning that we need to build next into our guidance here, is on top, after you determine that capacity, working on one-way hallways, so you could, limit contact in the hallways. And how do you, it's easier to keep kids in smaller units in an elementary school than a high school, and some thoughts on that. The last slides 24 here on, this looks familiar to you. These are those reopening strategies that we brought out in the last meeting. And several of you responded with some additional comments, which is awesome. And we've included those in orange so you can see where folks on this meeting have helped to modify the document. So again, as we send this to you, if you want to look through those and have any other ideas for those particular strategies, please circulate them. And special thanks to Guy as well, Idaho, who included some operational constraints to consider. Put that here on slide at the end slide. If you have, please look at that, and you can think of other things that obviously, you know, we need to look at. How do you staff these schools? And so thoughts on anything that you can share in terms of operational strategies with all of these reduced you know, capacity and increased challenges. You know, would love to hear your opinions, and we'll continue the conversation here next week. Okay,
Yeah,
Mary.
and one of the things just to say, just to close out, is some folks are suggesting that maybe we take a little longer next time, which I would love to do, so we can break into groups. I'm assuming that David will not be on a student laptop next week.
I'll actually have one. Yeah.
So I think it would be great to do that. The other thing that we are doing is sending it to a number of the groups in the Big Ed table who can provide us some of the help around mental health and online learning and after school, and because I know that some of their folks are working on this, and so we'll be able to you know, to get on the next round on terms of the budgeting. We should have some new numbers and insight. So that's good.
Yeah. So look forward to some new updates. Thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate this extended format week after week. Again, the intent is we really want to provide something that's going to be practically useful in the end. Hopefully we're working towards that. And we will schedule a slightly longer meeting next time. If you can't make it, of course, that's perfectly fine. We'll break into small groups, have some more feedback here on the budget we can put in, and have a deeper dive into some of these issues, and so hopefully some more information for you. So
yeah, and we'll email the slides. David, you can email the slides out and the spreadsheet right away, right?
Yep. As soon as I kick this thing and it starts working again, we'll get it out.
Yeah, and Amy, just to say on fall sports, the assumption is that there will be no fall sports. But I think that, you know, again, this is partly why we are reaching out to the national academies, because, I mean, maybe you can do cross country, maybe you can do cross country skiing, and, you know, this is New Hampshire. We want to get better input on that, you know, on all of those, you know, recess, all of that work. I think it's really important that we get.
Yeah, and Rhonda's question too, just, you know, that we've sort of assumed that these things are going to be canceled, yet if anybody who has ever had little children and you say we're not going to have recess or playgrounds and you're just going to sit all day, that's not going to fly. So I think the question is, how do we accommodate? Rhonda's question is spot on. What about playgrounds? How do we accommodate recess? How do we accommodate movement? Because we're going to need it.
Well, and there's a reality that we have to deal with. Idaho less maybe in others, but closing high school football in Texas is going to be a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in a lot of places.
Yeah, per Pedro's comment there.
So,
yeah. Unless you're
I think
running down the field with a mask on. I don't know, but it's going to be a challenge. But that's what I'd like to look at is how do we accommodate movement? You know, this the permanent screen time to wax philosophic here, seeing it firsthand and knowing it. I know us parents know that that's not something we want to sustain forever, and no teachers want that either. So to be continued.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, folks. Well, thank you so much, and we're really looking forward to kind of pulling this together and beginning to get some, you know, draft guidance out that you all can you know, continue to comment on.
Mary, I have one quick one before we lose everybody, and that's with the considerations on some liability coverage on businesses being discussed. This may be something that we want to look at in the educational world as well. That, you know, that liability for failure, someone goes home and infects somebody and away we go. The liability issues should be a concern.
Right. Right. And one of the things that I was wondering, Guy, and I don't know whether anyone else has talked to their insurance companies, those who are providing insurance, whether or not they are kind of what they're looking at. And I would be really interested to see, you know, what those conversations might be. So I think that actually would be a helpful thing to kind of inform us on this as well. You know, from a staffing, you know, HR liabilities, as well as you say, you know, if a student goes home and they say, no, you got it from somebody at school, and so you brought it into our family. And I think that would be helpful for us to understand.
We are impaneling we're starting our Build It with public health officials, operational folks, state board, and our liability carrier. And that first meeting is tomorrow. I'm going to ask the question. I will let you know.
Perfect.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Guy. It would be really, really helpful. All right, folks, you all take care, and we'll talk with you next week.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.